Dr. Thomas, the parole is yours, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mokbil. And first and foremost, thank you very much for the invitation to you and to your organization, OIPMA. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, ICCT, the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, was established 15 years ago by a decision of the Dutch Parliament to support and inform global efforts to prevent terrorism and violent extremism compliant and with respect to the rule of law and human rights. That is the mission of my organization. And therefore, it was for me obvious to come here, and I think it is particularly relevant to discuss the issue of terrorism on the occasion of this special day on fraternity. Hatred and intolerance are known sources of terrorism and violent extremism. In fact, one could argue they're part of the very definition of these concepts. Hatred and intolerance are part of extremist ideologies. Hatred and intolerance are sometimes even replace ideology, as in many places we see an increasing fascination for violence, which becomes the cause for terrorist engagement and sort of supersede ideology. It is also particularly important to have this discussion that we're having today in such distinguished company in this particular place under the auspices of OIPMA. Terrorism and violent extremism are global scourges, global challenges, sparing no country. But it is also well known that terrorism affects the most vulnerable, first and foremost. Most terrorist activities take place in countries that are already facing a myriad of other challenges, ranging from conflict to socio-economic deprivation. And yet too often, this is something that I have noted again and again over my 20 years of career in counterterrorism. Discussions about terrorism concentrate among a small group of countries, a small group of stakeholders, in particular among individuals from Western democracies, and neglect to properly include the most affected voices. So this forum today here strikes me as particularly relevant. It is also a good occasion to remind ourselves and everyone that efforts against terrorism and violent extremism must be locally rooted. They must take into account local needs, local realities, local voices, and concerns of local governments and population. These are those who know best what the problems are and what the solutions could be. Now, I've been invited here to reflect and share some lessons that we have learned about preventing and countering violent extremism and terrorism over decades of efforts. So what have we learned? I will highlight, if you allow me, 5 key lessons that we have learned over the past decades. The first lesson that we have learned is that pure force alone won't work. But yet, indeed, repression, to be sure, is a tool. You need legal tools, legal means. You need law enforcement capacities. You even need the military to be able to respond and repress terrorism and violent extremism when it reaches a certain level. And in that regard, capacity building efforts are still needed in many places. Capacity building efforts for law enforcement, prosecutors, investigators, police, military, civil society. This is all necessary to be more effective. But this is also necessary to be done, again, bearing in mind the respect for rule of law and human rights, because we know all too well that counterterrorism can sometimes become part of the problem. So we need to make sure that we support counterterrorism efforts that are not only effective, but that are also part of the solution and not exacerbating the problem. Secondly, as I said, force alone is not enough. And we have learned over the past decades that force must be complemented with prevention efforts. Prevention efforts include initiatives that seek to address the so-called root causes to violence and to extremism. In general, that includes, for instance, education programs, equality programs, social cohesion, economic development, or programs that support societal resilience more broadly. We've already heard several speakers address some of these issues. There's also more specific initiatives that can strengthen more specifically the resilience of the most vulnerable ones, for instance, the youth or displaced individuals. And there's also initiatives that are specifically aiming to reach out to those that are already concerned or involved in extremism. These are disengagement programs or rehabilitation programs, including those in prison and after prison. All of these are essential to our efforts against terrorism and extremism. And that is, I think, something we've learned over the past 2 decades, specifically this broadening of the counterterrorism spectrum to include prevention efforts. The third lesson that we've learned is the importance of a holistic and collaborative approach to address terrorism and violent extremism. We can only address these challenges if we adopt a whole-of-government approach, a whole-of-society approach, but also an international cooperative approach at the regional and the international level. And we've heard His Excellency President of the Southern Transition Council of Yemen particularly emphasize this aspect as well. A fourth lesson is that we also have learned the importance of tailored and targeted approaches to address extremism and terrorism. Before we start any program, any initiative, we need to make sure that we understand what the needs are on the ground. Any initiative, any program must be evidence-based, otherwise it will fail. We also need to work with local actors, local stakeholders. That includes local government, but also local civil society, religious leaders. Again, some of these points have been touched by some of the previous speakers. And in that regard, it is important not only to work with these local stakeholders, but it's also important to consider capacity building efforts towards and aiming at the local civil society. And I'm proud to say that my organization is involved in different regions of the world to specifically strengthen the capacities of civil society organizations that are active in the field of preventing violent extremism. We are, for instance, supporting organizations in Iraq or in the Western Balkans, among other places. And we've also learned, and this is becoming more obvious day after day, that these efforts can not only take place offline, but must also be complemented with online efforts, because, of course, it is obvious to say nowadays, but a lot of radicalization recruitment is taking place online. There's also a lot of issues related to misinformation or disinformation or hateful online campaigns that are exacerbating some of the conducive environment or leading to radicalization. And these must be addressed equally to offline issues. And fifth and final observation or lesson, every research, every evaluation that has been done on counterterrorism and the prevention of violent extremism has demonstrated that these efforts to fight or counter or prevent terrorism and violent extremism cannot be conceived outside of the full respect for the human rights and the rule of law. Otherwise, these will inevitably be counterproductive and become part of the problem more than part of the solution. So to conclude, the fight against terrorism and extremism, the fight against hatred and intolerance are inextricably interdependent. These are global challenges that require global mobilization and support and must be implemented at the local fashion. So the kind of old motto of think global, act local. And these challenges, and it's been said again a few times on this panel already, these challenges aren't going away. If anything, these challenges are actually becoming worse and worse year after year. So my call, my pledge here is that even in these times of, indeed, geopolitical tensions, even in these times of economic and financial austerity, we must ensure that we continue our work to support global efforts to prevent violent extremism and terrorism. Otherwise, this will only be another problem making our world a worse place to live. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Thomas.